That's the problem that Bitcoin is solving. It's reorganizing the resources in the economy to try to figure out, who can answer the question of what is money. So what is money today is an easier question, supposedly. So there's multiple answers to the question. Somebody say, well, it's if you take the famous video from the guy from the Fed, it's like, well, it's just an entry in a database in a computer. Elon Musk will say, like, well, it's an information system, and whoever has the database with the lowest latency transaction processing, that's what money is. But if you actually go to the central bank, and they'll be like, well, it's this, like curated basket of goods that we decided is the things in the economy that everybody. Wait. What did you say? It's a basket of goods. Okay, we'll make the 2018 starter kit. We're going to put a Mac Mini in it because we think those computers, we actually agree. They're really, really, really useful. If everybody has a computer, like, we can use Bitcoin.
Mark Wilcox is the founder of the Magic Numbers Project, 21E8.
Good morning, Scott.
Thank you for being here. If you don't know Mark, and most people watching this probably will, he's been involved in the tech scene. Really, it's the best way to define it is where theology meets technology. It's where the divine meets technology, or offering a, well, you can define it yourself. Is that fair, Mark?
I would sort of like put myself sort of like a tier down. I would really say like Ardian is kind of like this, sort of like guiding light on explaining, how technology sits with theology. I don't come from that background, but I found the more I learned about technology, the more I spent in that area, the more I understood what these guys are saying. And I'm sort of like not a baptized Orthodox Christian, but I find myself sort of like associating with and making friends with and understanding more what they say than all this other kind of confusing information that's out there in the world at the moment. And sort of when you're looking for stable grounding, then you eventually sort of start to put the pieces together. But I would sort of like more. I really like this pairing of memory and money. So this whole project is and Bitcoin in general. Like we kind of approach it from an information perspective, and sort of like learn about what money is or was from a memory or culture perspective as well. And then sort of like, a bunch of sort of like memories that I think that, our civilization has maybe largely forgotten, or maybe they're just sitting there dormant, but we don't know how to access them. Then they seem to come alive again.
Yeah, there seems to be, especially with AI, a kind of opaque escalation where people try to make it more opaque. That only seems to be a helpful thing when a philosopher, say like Nick Land, might do it, when he's actually trying to lead. Well, I think he's trying to lead, unless he's been guided by principalities that actually just want to make everything opaque. But he's leading you to a truth that you wouldn't otherwise be provoked to. He's provoking you in a way to disclose the truth to yourself. That's like symbolism as well. And so I see that a lot in your posts. It's sort of posting something. There's all, even within the wider group of the 21E8 Magic Numbers Company associated people, the way they post as well, it has that quality to it. So do you think that's necessary, that we need to lead people to the truth that way, rather than, because we speak in the terms of liberal modernity, we're just stuck in that human, that normal understanding of the world, rather than actually bringing people out?
Maybe that's sort of like relates to the other conversation about, well, it's sort of like the theologian's job to lead people to the truth. But it's sort of, if you kind of align with that and you're being led by them, but you're a technologist, or you're like, okay, so what can I do to help? Then 100% is like, we need an information environment that makes it easy to you know, like access information, like information that you can verify, that you can trust. And really it's not just about accessing information. That's sort of like, you know, the problem, if you will. It's who are we, and what are we here to do, and like, you know, what should we spend our time on. And sort of like this year it's like, hey, does anybody have any jobs for me? Like our sort of like, you know, things have sort of progressed a little bit past this like civilizational theory, like you know, the previous sort of like church is sort of like in the process of collapsing at the moment. So like while that's going on, it's you know, the problems that people are dealing with are a little bit more practical, sort of like this year and last year, which is like, hey guys, like Nvidia went down 10% yesterday. Does anyone know what I should do with my money? And sort of we're like, you know, that Bitcoin thing, like, did you know that you can use it, right? And that's pretty much, you know, like the cover story for you know, almost anything that, like, yes, you might get deeper into the rabbit hole, but at the bottom of it, you kind of like, you know, you work your way back up, back to the start again, and you're like, maybe we should just use that Bitcoin thing, and we'll just cancel out all this other stuff that's, you know, just sitting there trying to plug the gap of the fact that, you know, people keep messing with the monetary supply, right?
Yeah, so would you say that that's the main thing that you've been doing now with the project? It's to lead people to that. Like Bitcoin sort of has a contact with truth itself as a protocol, really. Is that what you've been trying to do?
Well, if you think about that, if you think about what that project is, well, what we're really talking about is Bitcoin, right? And so I actually sort of started, was sort of, the goal was to start a business in like late 2019. And there was a very strong sense of urgency at the time that like something was about to happen, and we had to move now. And it wasn't like, you know, time to sit around and explain everything to everybody. We were under like, you know, extreme levels of uncertainty. But if you had sort of like, if you were grounded and you had a notion of like what needed to be done to solve the problem, at the time it was really like, hey, we need to go somewhere that is safe. Like we need to create a space in person that we can go and, you know, sit and talk to each other, right? And so I was when I was doing that, that was already too late. You know, I spent the first 2 years of the company sort of like waiting for international, you know, flights to start up again, and all this kind of thing. And it was 2022 before that could really take shape. And then sort of like the 2 years after that was sort of like, you know, experiencing the correction. So we're sort of, you know, like what we were kind of like a esoteric fourth thing, where there was like the 3 Bitcoin forks. Bitcoin forked and it had this war in 2017, right? So since then it was in this sort of like modern, you know, it was like the modernization of Bitcoin, because you can pick any, you know, it's like Protestantism. Which denomination do you like? Do you like the store of value, or do you like the medium of exchange, or do you like the unit of account? And no, you can't have all 3, right? It's like the good, fast, cheap triangle. And we were like, hey, we would really like all 3, please and thank you. And I knew what GPUs were and how they worked. So, and that blockchain thing was like just some database with magical numbers and hashes. So we just sort of like, you know, the aim was to initially like do that, you know, in public and on Bitcoin, and we were able to prove a bunch of the early ideas that way. But then, you know, like everybody lived through 2020 and 2021. And so there wasn't really that much to do if you didn't want to in public, if you didn't want to paint a target on your back, right? Yeah. Thankfully, a lot of the Elon thing and everything, like he kind of, you know, was sort of the most liberalized, and he ended up sort of like, you know, trying to escape. So that wave is like propagating at the moment. It's been propagating for about 2 years now. It's going to take probably another 2 years to like finish propagating. It's the 250th anniversary of the United States, you know, in July 4th, 2026 next year, when they end the Doge project. So I'm sort of just like sit around and wait for that to blow over. And then once the dust settles, then we go like, okay, are we allowed to use the Bitcoin thing now? And then we'll see what happens. But for now, I'm just sort of like, you know, keeping the lights on and selling Mac Minis because I think that on that sort of time frame, if people start to use Mac Minis, which the last 12 months is sort of, this made some nice progress. If we can do a little, like Nick Land for marketing, hyperstition tell the market that they need to buy this product that Apple doesn't know how to sell to Bitcoin. If we just sell it to Bitcoin for them, then as long as they get off the Raspberry Pis and the Intel chips, then like we'll probably be all right for 20 years.
Yeah. That seems like a great transition into a specific hardware from, maybe you can talk a little bit about that, because you've been quite brave, I think, in terms of sort of exploding into that when you founded the company side of the project, when the project became a company, in a very dangerous time, but also allowing, and people who watch this channel should understand this a bit, allowing it's sort of, which you do with art, and any great inventor does the same thing, where you allow the thing to emerge while you're working on it. You know, you don't have the specific, clear, exact goal about the exact thing from the start, because you have to discover it first. And maybe you could talk a bit about how that transitioned and changed into what you're doing now, like, because you've sort of talked about that with practicality and how it's changed. But that were my thoughts about it.
Yeah, well, I guess it was when we sort of like think of it kind of like we're in like version 2 now, and version 2 is like quite boring. We're in like different interest rate environment, and it's not the same thing as like when you turn everything up to 11, when you're really having to do that speculative job. But the project initially, and this sort of like first project that we've done, essentially, the company was the project, because the project of Bitcoin was like, well, it was sort of like getting to the end of its startup phase, and then sort of like, yeah, but like we're like Intel Corporation, but there's no CEO and nobody knows what to do, which is like, now that's just Intel, right? So Intel has that problem. But it was like, okay, it's like if they didn't just tell Tim Cook to run the company when Steve Jobs like ate too many strawberries. But like Satoshi, he just like disappeared, and then 10 years later we're like, hey, this Bitcoin thing, does anybody know what we're supposed to be doing? And it was like, all right, guys, like, we're just going to make the Bitcoin company. And then we'll just like, have a corporate structure and a legal entity and all these types of things. And then like, we'll just tell you that, you need to go and do X and Y and Z, right? And there was this sort of like enormous capacity and value and everything that was like floating around Bitcoin. That was the coordination problem, like to do it online was too difficult. And that pressure was really like mounting, right? To the point that like the opposite thing was happening, which is that everybody who did everything in person in offices, like in the city, they all went and sat on Zoom calls like they were like Bitcoin crypto people, just like doing things on the internet and trading stocks on their other screen, right? For like good 2 years essentially. And then now there's this correction where like those guys are back in the office, and we're sort of like, okay, we'll just go back to doing the Bitcoin thing, like over the internet, right? But that was like the first project. I really don't have, and that was intentional. In the current sort of mode, we're sort of like dealing with the fallout of that, which is that everything that I'm doing at the moment is sort of like accidental. It's like, okay, like we had to make all these decisions. And by the way, like NVIDIA and OpenAI and all these other guys who've like done this big, huge, like, Bitcoin driven infrastructure build out in the last 4 years. They're not out there. Like there was sort of like a brief moment where a week before Sam Altman was getting fired by the board of OpenAI, where he was like asking the Saudis for $7 trillion. And at that point, then you're like, yeah, that's not going to happen. And he was being laughed out of the room by the TSMC guy saying, I want to build 49 fabs. And so we're in like a correction era from that, which is like, okay, we know how to do this speculative, like, let's imagine all of the potential value and wonderful things that could happen. But now we have to deal with the reality of the situation after we've made that commitment and investment, but that hasn't actually come true yet. Okay, they've sort of like, they get the Japanese guy to come along and say like, here's a really big number that we'll just sort of like have as a carrot. It's not a real number, by the way. The real number is 10. But like, maybe we'll just, give you another check and give you another check and give you another check for the 4 years of the Trump admin, and then just see if you can, like figure out how to get your shit together, between now and then. If we sort of hold this current moment and then that continues to happen, then a bunch of other maybe, like conflicts that happened in the last cycle, maybe we can maybe sort of like find a way to avoid those things and settle them down and everything, and not have like 5 to 7 more. And there's some very interesting stuff with Elon and Taiwan and XAI and Tesla. If you go and rebuild all of the timelines, but he was sort of like he was handed this biggest like nuclear bomb of systemic risk, and somehow managed to defuse that. And so he's sort of like for some period he gets permission to kind of like he was able to cross the Rubicon of like, I know how to talk to China and the United States, so let's just sort of like fly back and forth and sort of do the GPU thing and everything, sort of like try to settle things down so that we don't so that we can like move TSMC to Arizona and stuff like that.
And what I thought was really striking about the 21E8 project was your part. I don't know if you could call it a marketing campaign. It was more a practical application of Land's philosophy with hyperstition, I think. And what, for the audience at home, hyperstition means the effects of belief on reality. You can call them magical effects, right? So you could call it like hype's effects, but not just as a social phenomena. Actually,
it's like applied faith.
That's right, but it's not. It's a temporal phenomena. It's not a providential phenomena. This is how I would disagree with Land here, because that's why I'm a Christian, right? So these are magical effects, not sacred magic. It's different. Yep. But what I want to single out here is if you search 21E8 on Twitter, you'll notice all manner of people posting about this thing, and it was completely organic in the way that it expanded. So it's really a masterful thing to apply hyperstition in that way. And you'll see, who Amanda Grimes is. She talked about it and about Chloe 21E8 in one of her speeches, didn't she? And so those effects were quite striking, of just seeing it grow organically. This isn't something that was paid for. These weren't ads. These weren't shills. There were people naturally coming on board. Maybe you can talk a bit about that. Or how much strategy was behind that? What were your intentions there, and how much of it just took on a life of its own?
Well, if you think about it, like all of Twitter is just filled with people on there, shilling their investments, right? What was different was that we were operating at this like lower level, and then otherwise, like, so all anybody is really talking about when they're talking about 21E8 is they're talking about Bitcoin, but they have a different name for it, and and that different name unlocks a completely different sort of lens over it, because you're like, okay, well, what are all of the things that the name Bitcoin represents? Okay, it's like money and payments and like the price going up. Okay, well, if you Google search 21E8, then you're not going to find like the Bitcoin price and such and such, right? What you will find is like you'll find things about the proof of work, and then you'll go like, you'll find some people asking questions that they won't ask questions when they're just sort of like in the Church of Rome, right? That they're told that this is how it is and what things mean, and you shouldn't think of things any other way because we've interpreted it all for you, right? It's like, yeah, but there's some sort of like guys over there, but if you go a bit more east, then they sort of like they're from like the before times, and they sort of like they also know what the thing is, but they weren't but they're like, no, we'll just go think for ourselves, thank you very much. Right. But otherwise, like from a technical standpoint, it's what's called a magic number. So the whole point is that, well, it's open to interpretation. So as long as if you direct your attention towards the number versus directing your attention to some interpretation like Grok or Claude or some other name that they try to give these systems, right? And then AI itself is just a rebranding of, it's a competing brand name to the category of systems that like Bitcoin is competing in the market share for, right? So it's like Mac versus PC, completely different system, like looks nothing like it, but we're talking about big data centers that consume lots of energy and capital and attention, right? And so, well, at the end of the day, it's going to be that thing, or it's going to be this thing, unless maybe like some people who actually kind of like know how things work, they find a way to be like, hey, we'll take some of that and we'll take some of that. Thank you very much. And like, also it would be nice if we could spend our Bitcoin on things so that, you know, we don't just like crash the entire economy. So your point about the marketing is that's like naturally something that everybody is already going on doing. Look at Michael Saylor, look at Trump, right? Like, that's the conversation that everybody is having, but it's all intermediated by this financialization that comes from like the dollar system. So fundamentally, if you're talking about Bitcoin, if you're using the word Bitcoin, you're inherently talking about its stock, not its product. And its product is like, you know, this sort of like difficult thing that we don't quite understand yet. Part of the reason for that is that, well, Bitcoin is like based on subsidies. And those subsidies are like, you know, futures contracts. It's what's called a perpetual future contract for like something that doesn't exist yet. And, you know, and aside from learning like, well, these are the capabilities and interesting features of the Bitcoin system today, which is quite different now, like with AI data centers and everything existing than it was like in 2017, right? And you can sort of take a lot of that maybe into context of sort of, there was an understanding of that there's going to be these huge massive data centers, like, hey, we would like them in the dollar system, very you know, thank you very much, like we really wouldn't like them on running on Bitcoin. Then there's an emergency kind of like front run to like find some way to build and fund that infrastructure. So whether that comes from the edge, which I saw as like, hey, there's this really important missing gap, which is that there's no customers. We'll just play the role of the demanding, you know, consumer customer that like shitposts on the internet, but we'll actually tell the market, no, we don't want like customer support AI chatbots, you know, okay, maybe like this decade, we really need video games. Can you please make something that's at least as good as Halo? Because if it's not as good as Halo, I'll just go buy an Xbox One and I'll be fine. Like, you know, go come up with some innovation. You know, like, you know, go figure out some more, you know, some more ideas, right? So unless they can make a computing system that's more entertaining, which at the moment Twitter is like, you know, the most entertaining thing that you can do on a phone, and even then I like leave my phone at home all day, and you know, like we're not in the it's not 2021, it's not time to like go on the internet and like, you know, do Peppy Frog NFT display picture tokens. Actually, like, you know, we got a real economy that needs fixing, and largely a lot of the risk and everything else that was going on in the last cycle is abated for now, right? But I'll say one last thing, which is that the risk manifests differently in these different economies. So in New Zealand, like we don't have the type of grid problems that Texas has. In El Salvador, you know, they like, hey, can you, for our really big buildings, can you you know, like, can you come and help us? Hey, Mr. American, can you come and help us build a really big prison? Thank you. But things in, you know, Gaza and everything else like that looks different over there. So we don't know what the you know, the new infrastructure that will get built out in the cycle will look like. I thought it was going to be happening in Japan. Doesn't look like much is happening in Japan at the moment. They've sort of just taken the Japanese money and given it to Sam Altman and said that you have to spend it in America on something. I guess we will have like by 2028, by the next halving, we'll have these XAI data centers will have like gone through several iterations. So maybe by the end of this cycle, that will look a bit better than it does today. But I think it already looks quite substantially different with these projects. There's one from Meta in Louisiana. There's one, the XAI one is in Tennessee, and the OpenAI one is being built by a Bitcoin miner in Texas. That's the Stargate project. So people don't quite know how to like put the two in context, because they think that Bitcoin is a financial asset, and because it's so good at virtualizing itself, you know, you can get pretty far down the track without even having to think about the existence of the infrastructure that underlies it. Yeah.
Maybe I think there's some good points there on the existential battle between the LLM and Bitcoin itself. maybe you can expand upon with some analogies to help more traditionalist types understand why it is that Bitcoin's on our side, or we should be on Bitcoin's side, and why the LLM is our enemy and why we shouldn't be on the LLM's side.
Have you ever heard of the Large Bitcoin Collider?
No.
There's a massive distributed network of GPUs that generate ECGSA key pairs all day, hoping that like maybe they'll just, you know, by chance strike gold on somebody's address and they'll just take their Bitcoins. So LLMs are a much more advanced, you know, Ethereum also. GPUs are like on Ethereum. You had this, hey, let's go make this other cryptocurrency that uses GPUs. Let's go take a bunch, all the GPU inventory, and let's go, hey, shiny other coin over here. Let's just print a bunch of them for ourselves and then go sell them and sell them to Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Right. So there's entire sort of almost all of the speculative capital in the economy is going into these various different schemes because Bitcoin is really difficult to mine.
Yeah.
And it's cryptographically secure. Maybe I can go use the computers to go hack some non-cryptographically secure system like the TV, like the newspaper, like the social network, like the domain name system, like your bank. And then we'll get you to send us the money and then we'll buy the Bitcoin with it. Right. And so that's all that's going on with LLMs, which is like, wow, here's shiny. Can you like Masayoshi-san, can you give us $500 billion? Thank you. And then literally the same company that like builds the Bitcoin data was building the Bitcoin data centers like 2 years ago in Texas. Yeah, they're like, okay, yeah, we'll go right. And then like MicroStrategy is another one of these. Hey, like pension funds, we'll just buy the Bitcoin directly. Like we'll save you a bunch of time. Everybody knows that this is happening everywhere. Can you just give us money and we'll go buy the Bitcoins? Right. Except then Bitcoin goes down in price. So there's this like two-way street, right? But you can't get your money out of a pension fund. So like, you know, that trick's probably going to work like 5 more, you know, at least until the end of this cycle. I think probably like, you know, one cycle before that as well. Because there's a lot of other rebuilding of the economy and like, you know, transitioning into Bitcoin that needs to happen. And that sort of like transitioning is only just starting since January 20th with the Doge project in the US. So I think we have a long time before that wavefront like propagates out to, you know, even down to you know, like commerce, but really out to the rest of the world, right? Because the internet doesn't have any boundary, doesn't have any border that's limiting it at the start. And that border actually is Bitcoin. And, you know, the internet infrastructure right now, like Bitcoin is expanding that border with Starlink as opposed to, you know, like limiting it on the way back. Only certain like big powers who have who sort of, you know, if you're like the scale of China, then where you already had quite a lot of disconnection from the West, you can do it. But countries like the EU now and even New Zealand is looking at this like, oh, big boogeyman Trump, you know, like we need to limit this because they have, you know, all of their eggs in the are not in the Bitcoin basket, and they need to find a way to like regain some sovereignty before, you know, like the Americans just come in and buy all of Europe, right? Which is not that there's this project called Praxis, which that is not too far away from the truth. You will see projects that look somewhere along those lines, you know, before 2028.
Yeah. So how though is Bitcoin a good thing for traditionalist types though? I mean, I see what you're saying there in terms of the battle between the LLM and Bitcoin, but it's talked a lot about Bitcoin monasteries, right? This idea that people post about it a lot. Is it why should this be something that people that are Christian inclined to get behind, or to get behind? That's the second half of the question we didn't get to, I think.
I think like the center that currently sort of like holds the holds the coins of Bitcoin at the moment, you know, they're very much this sort of establishment. And they will use the term of a Bitcoin cathedral. And so there's a very different nature of a cathedral, which is in the center of the city, and the monastery, which is, like basically, trying to escape the world so that you can reorganize it, from this foundation, right? Now, I really like the quote from Ardian, because he says it straight up, that Bitcoin is the enemy. So in the sort of like liberal world at the moment, well, everybody's turning schizophrenic and seeing enemies in anybody else who is acting in a way that they're resisting. They're resisting the terraforming. All right. And it's not even, like advanced philosophy. There's the concept of the necessary evil. Well, Bitcoin is just this like monetary thing that it just can't be inflated. So there's no negotiating with it. It's going to do the thing. It's just some algorithm that's out there, and there's a bunch of people running it, and it's massively distributed and resilient. So there's nobody you can go and attack to do it. Right. Yeah. So given that there aren't some Bitcoin people that are running it, that you see them all and, sitting around some big evil round table, and you can say like, hey, we're at war with those people. You saw people try to do that with the World Economic Forum. And it's like, if you knew how like boring and corporate and like that they're not going to harm anything, like you going and you seeing them as like much bigger and scarier than they actually are, is giving them actually too much credence. All you're doing is like, you're amplifying them, and it's going to come back at you, because now you're terrified of them. Right. But yeah, there's this idea of the necessary evil. Well, it's our collective, like coordination problem that we're dealing with in the modern economy and society, that we have to figure out how to make it compatible with not just sort of like, diluting culture and all our values and like just doing more material scale up. We have to figure out how to incorporate, how we decide what to do and what not to do, and not just have like, a computer simulation show us a graph where we can magically, everybody can have everything, and it can all be sunflowers and daisies, right? So there's this like coordination problem of playing the role of the enemy that Bitcoin is doing, which is in the subsidy, because everybody who makes any money off Bitcoin, whether that be Bitcoin miners, who are actually the ones who are at least like doing something productive that's verifiable out in the world, right? Which has lots of side benefits, or whether you're just sort of like, hey, like BlackRock, you get a handicap now because you can just like put some huge amount of your portfolio into Bitcoin, and then eventually you don't even have to do any calculations, right? So there's like solving the problem of like, shit, every boomer in the economy like gave one dude on Wall Street like all of their money to like manage for all of the future, and he's a little bit in over his heels. There's this guy Hayek who sort of said that you can't centrally plan all the economy, and like, wasn't that the communists anyway? Didn't go too well in the 20th century. And then he's basically just sitting there going, what if we simulate capitalism, and then everybody can, and it can all work out, right? And that's essentially what China, the conclusion that China came to, and enabled them to be doing what they're doing. They're like America now, right? Whereas America is like they've had a rotation from modes. They're now the late Soviet Union, figuring out that they were, that the end result of capitalism as they were able to build it was just like, what if we centrally plan and socialize and account for everything through finance? And then they just outsourced everything to China, right? So it'd be interesting what role Russia ends up playing in the next sort of like 20, 30 years, because they're already, like they've gone through the cycle before in the 20th century, right? So they know where certain things lead. And, Ardian, he'll point at the Orthodox cathedral. And that's where he says, yeah, the West cannot build that. and it's physical standing proof that that the West doesn't have this sort of like creative moral authority, right? That's why it can't make good movies anymore. And so if America's not careful, the Russians will just like, you know, it's like New Zealand in 2003 making Lord of the Rings. Like the Russians will just go make English Lord of the Rings, like Silmarillion TV show, like way better than anybody knows how to do at Amazon, right? And if they start doing that, then that will cause real problems for America, because all of America's economy right now is still pretty much like this. You know, they're acting like it's 1997 or like you know, like March 2001. You know, like the maybe like the right past like the peak of like Western civilization. It was like the release of the Xbox, and we're a long way away from like recreating that moment, even with how good the GPUs are and all the technology at the moment. So if we're lucky, Bitcoin between now and like 2023, it will figure out how to make like not Halo 4 like diluted game after it like became not the job of Bungie Studios, but they'll figure out how to put Bungie Studios back together and tell them that they need to fix up Halo 4 and come up with the canonical story of whatever was supposed to happen after Halo 3, because they just made up bullshit behind that. And I have one more thing I wanted to say on that topic is in 2018 Kodak was sort of revived. I think it was 2018. And they sort of like tried to go make a Bitcoin ASIC business. Like they announced a miner, didn't go anywhere, but it was really interesting. And maybe like 3 months ago or something, some shit poster like he bought the trademark for Enron.
Really?
And he's out there like making like, you know, like you know, it's a joke, right? But it's more advanced than the Kodak thing was also a joke, but they were really serious about like, you know, some Bitcoin company basically bought their brand and like, hey, maybe if we use the brand recognition that's in the name Kodak, maybe we can use that to go and get ourselves into the mining business, right? Same thing is going on with Enron. So it's possible that other companies that are sort of like a Blockbuster, for example. I also think that GameStop and AMC, this is what was happening with them in the last cycle, and they've managed to like turn themselves into a meme stock. You know, far before all the meme coins. So you know, between now and 2030, watch to see any other like name brand, you know, any other brand that still contains memory and meaning of like, you know, when the US was still producing things, and that's still part of your identity. Every time you see this revival, it's like, you know, it only took 7 days for Jesus to come back from the cross. Look for how quickly all these other brands and all this other history, you know, starts popping up, because when that's happening, that is Bitcoin. That is the driving force and enabling you to do that. It's proof of like, hey, if somebody can just figure out how to go say those words that you know we're not allowed to say anymore, then like somebody's just going to come and give you, you know, like $10 million.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a bit of hyperstition in that too. I guess connected with what you're saying there, I guess an analogy we could say for people who are traditionalist types or even just Christians is that you could say it's a shield. Bitcoin's a shield for you while you undergo the monastic research that allows you to do these things like you're talking about with Russia. You could even call them a kind of monastery on the edge. Not that I think that much of Putin. I don't think he's that much a believer. But yeah, it seems like that's the analogy. It's a sort of financial and technical shield because it has technical benefits. It's not just a financial value holder. It has technical benefits. So if you're doing research towards the truth, there is some sense that it being connected with you, because its protocol allows it to hold to something that will have positive effects, not just financial. I suppose you could say.
It's like purely rational, purely neutral, right? It holds all the cards and it doesn't give a shit about you. So it actually enables you to not do any of those things, realize that you're not a crypto hash miner, and that you have to find a way to negotiate this thing, right? With this thing. And so therefore it forces you to pick a side. It's like, okay, you're on the side, are you on the side of good or evil, right? And if you think about the 20th century, it was sort of about the end of history was like, yeah, but we're all friends now, and like good is bad and bad is good and 1 is 0, and we have computers that can like present anything in any different way you would like. Do you want a cherry on your ice cream, right? And then after a certain amount of like bad decisions of people wanting to do things any way that they would like, then people are like, yeah, can you not do those things over there? And then as soon as somebody starts doing that, then you're at the end of it. You're basically, you gotta unwind the entire 20th century, probably a little bit before that as well. Arden will say that, we gotta go back to Martin Luther. And actually, like, AI and technology is awesome to the extent that, like, yep, let's generate like money printing. That was tiny and easy. Like, let's just generate infinite books of all of the words, and like everybody just get all of the symbol photocopying out of your system. Okay, great. Like, now that we've photocopied every symbol in existence, let's figure out the ones that got photocopied the most, and like let's only do that and make sure that nobody can come in and just change all the words this week. Which obviously there's a lot of that going on, not just in the 20th century, but you can look at the entire Church of England was based on the creation of the Church of England was like based on, hey, I want to edit the book, right? And so there's sort of like too much of the editing of the book going on in England, these days. Not that you're in England either, but thematically you're a lot closer. Australia has maybe like 100 years more history. I
think both we're both places we are from. They just are essentially Anglo. So, but the theme of the show certainly is taking roots in that aesthetic. So you've made a lot of really good predictions here, and from my understanding, they seem pretty sound. I can see how that will unfold. Maybe you can talk a bit about how you're responding to those predictions, what your objectives are now with the project, and what you're doing particularly. And maybe after that, you could maybe with those predictions. So that's about you, and then the second part, maybe you could talk about what people should do that are watching in response to these things and these forces.
Well, it's pretty easy actually. Like, we're only left with a certain capability. It was certain things that we got done and certain things that we learned. And so I said to a friend of mine, I guess sort of like a year ago, when we were still kind of like coming down from events 2023, that essentially, like, the value of something is like the value of some information is the price that you paid to learn it. So in the last few years, different people have paid a really high price to learn certain things, about each other, about technology, about the world, doesn't matter. And sort of we have we were one of these like last companies sort of like starting up before COVID, right? And I had very early deep sort of exposure, not just to Bitcoin stuff. That was actually sort of like, I was kind of like playing catch up and learning and, watching, trying to decode things that I was seeing on Twitter, like like while you're sleep deprived and working on projects and things. But particularly like got a really early sign into this GPU work and what became AI, like before there was any exposure to LLMs. And everybody right now, they have the difficulty, not just of the scale of it and how fast it moves and how much competition there is in the space, but actually like they have to interpret so much more through a bigger stack, because there's all these sort of like things that have been added in there, and you have to find a way to filter out of how much AI tech has been built out of fake money, what of it is real and what of it is fake. And just look at this DeepSeek thing where even if you take like a full-on conspiracy, all of these people who are moving all the strings, like they're way out of their depths, caught up on all their own problems at the moment, where even they're shocked when something like DeepSeek will come in and basically be you might try to put exports control over this technology, but did you know you can like optimize it in 5 minutes, and then you'll like make 5 times more profit at the same time, right? So I was sort of like left with a bunch of that, and at the time that we were doing it, it was like you still had all this like active risk in the market. So like it was our job to like keep a lid on everything and like stop that from releasing, because it's not enough to just sort of like, you can't go and de-risk like a little bit if you then destroy somewhat proportional more value. And it wouldn't have helped us anyway, because like we were doing the job that startups are supposed to do, where you run on like max leverage every single second, and you're always like 5 minutes from 5 minutes from death, and you're not at 5 minutes from death, then you haven't you're not doing a good enough job at chasing the market, right? So we ended up with a bunch of that, but we also had a bunch of things that we didn't know that we missed out on. Namely, there is this LLM market, this AI market that didn't really exist before. I wasn't really, focused on or thinking about it. I was really focused on Bitcoin networking stuff, like when we started, and we only like ended up sort of like through doing too much R&D and everything, like, starting to find to work our way into that market as well. And we ended up with a product that was very different from when I first started, which was when we were doing the state of markets and social media algorithms and attention and everything. So that ended up, that market did come true, but it was just easier to click the button on Twitter to like, go, hey, actually like that yes, we may have been like, our initial plan was like try to hyperstition that into existence, because the idea that you would do a deal to integrate some new technology into Twitter, well, like, that was like let's do things that are more practical, like hyperstition and making your own websites, right? If like we just shill everything to like go use some other website, that's much easier than trying to convince somebody to do something that is quite confusing, that there is not really like in line with what they're doing anyway. It is more in line with like Elon's business, but honestly, like that was only because he was kind of forced into that situation, because he had a bunch of these, he was holding on to all this other systemic risk in his other companies, and then now like the fact that he managed that risk is now that's all a level above him, right? So but what we did learn was what business that we should have been in the beginning, right? And how that would work. And it's not so easy, and it's actually not the right time for it now. The right time for it is like more in the next cycle. We need to prepare for being able to sell nodes that like incorporate, that represent this reality, right? Which at the moment is like, okay, like what if we have a node that you can host at home that runs Bitcoin and it runs an LLM? Essentially, right? That's like today's, how you would explain this to somebody today. It's not actually what you want. You don't actually, like, just running a Bitcoin node isn't that useful. Like you only really need have a little wallet that can send payments, right? Having an ecosystem of things you can make payments for, well, that doesn't exist at the moment. But if everyone sort of like just ran LLM services where you pay money to like generate the tokens on the LLM, and then we just do that, that would solve a bunch of problems in the AI market. And there are companies out there that are working on that at the moment. What they don't have is they're still working in this like speculative VC sort of business, and they don't have a way to ramp. So there isn't an idea that, hey, if you're somebody who like actually makes there's a project called Truffle, really cool project, but they're on NVIDIA tech. Like I also started out on NVIDIA tech, realized that like this isn't going to scale to mass user consumption. We need to do something that, ideally people already have the equipment at home, or you can, that if the hypermania and everything started tomorrow, then everyone can go buy out all the inventory of Apple computers.
The second part of this conversation is available for fellowship joiners. The links are in the replies. join my website at scottmannion.com/fellowship or on substack.scottmannion.com.